Myst, the Book of Tiana, continues with Part 1.5 as read by the bathroom reader. I am covering for the Plurality Report, who has since sailed away to China in a little rowboat to find ya. The great feast to celebrate the cutting of the great shaft was almost over. Young guildsmen from the Guild of Artists looked on from the edge of events, hurriedly sketching the scene as the great men said their farewells to each other. It had been an extraordinary occasion, with speeches and poems in honor of this latest venture of the Donny people. A year from now, a whole series of new canvases and tapestries would hang in the corridors of the guild house back in Donny, capturing the occasion for posterity, but just now the guildmasters talked of more mundane affairs. Matters of state stopped for no man and no occasion, even one so great as this, and there was ever much to be discussed. It was not often that one saw all 18 major guilds represented in a single place, and the colorful sight of their distinctive ceremonial cloaks, each guild's color different, each cloak decorated with the symbols of that specific, the rank and status of the guildsman who wore it, gave Atris an almost childish delight. Such things he had only glimpsed in books before now. Atris's own cloak, like those of all young guildsmen without rank, had 8 such symbols, 4 to each side, beneath the lapels, whereas those of the great lords had but a single one. Looking on from where he sat on the far side of the feasting circle, Atris saw Veovis rise from his seat to greet one of the great lords, his friendly deference making the old man smile. 4 of the 5 were here today, the 5th, Veovis's father, being too ill to come. All 18 of the Grand Masters were also here to represent their guilds, along with several hundred of their most senior masters, every one of them resplendent in their full guild colors. To a young guildsman they seemed an impressive host. Lord Tula, it was said, was 287 years old, and his 3 companions, Lords Rihira, Nehir, and Inea, were all well into their 3rd century. Veovis, by comparison, was but a babe, a glint of sunlight against dark shadow. Lord Tula, in particular, looked like something carved, as if, in the extremity of age, he had become the rock in which he had lived all his life. One day, perhaps, Atris too might become a Grand Master, or perhaps even one of the 5. Yet the road that led to such heights was long and hard, and some days he wondered if he had the temperament. If this expedition had proved one single thing to him, it was that he was of essence a loner. He had thought, perhaps, that such close proximity to his fellows day in, day out, might have brought him out of his shell, rounding off the hard edges of his nature, but it had not proved so. It was not though that he did not get on with his fellow cadets. He liked them well enough, and they seemed to like him. It was simply that he did not share their pursuits, their constant need for small distractions. "You were born old, Atris," his mother had so often said, "too old and too serious," and it had worried him, but now he knew he could not change what he was, and others, Master Tilanus among them, seemed to value that seriousness. They saw it not as a weakness, but as a strength. Even so, he wondered how well he would settle back into the life of the guild house. It was not the work, the studying and practicals that concerned him, but the personal element. Watching the great men at the feast had reminded him of that, of the small personal sacrifices one made to be a senior guildsman. Given the choice, Atris would have spent his whole life exploring, drilling through the rock and surveying, but that, he understood, was a young man's job, and he would not be a young man all his life. In time he would be asked to take charge of small projects at first, but then steadily larger and larger tasks, and in so doing he would have to deal not with the dynamics of rock, the certainties of weight and form and pressure, but with the vagaries and inconsistencies of personality. He looked across, catching Tilenus' eye. The guildmaster smiled and raised the silver goblet he was holding in a toast. Atris raised his own uncertainly, but did not sip. Many of his companions were drunk, but he had not touched even a drain of the strong wine that he had been served. Indeed, if the choice had been given him, he would have left an hour back after the last speech, but it was not deemed polite for any of them to leave before their masters, and so they sat amid the ruins of the feast, looking on as the old men went from table to table.
"Look," someone whispered to Atris's right. "The young lord is coming over here."
Atris looked up to see Veovis making his way across. Seeing Atris, Veovis smiled, then turned to address Tilenus. "Master Tilenus, might I have a word in private with Guildsman Atris?"
"Of course,"
Tilenus answered, giving the slightest bow of respect. Atris, embarrassed by the sudden attention, rose and made his way around the table to where Veovis stood. "Forgive me, Atris," Veovis began, keeping his voice low. "Once more I must rush off, but Lord Tula has given me permission to stay on an extra day. I thought we might talk tomorrow after the breaching." The breaching was a small ceremony to mark the commencement of the breakthrough tunnel. Atris nodded. "I'd welcome that." "Good." Briefly Veovis held his arm, then, as if he understood Atris's embarrassment, let his hand fall away. "Tomorrow, then." That evening they winched the excavator up onto the platform at the very top of the great shaft. Atris, standing beside Master Tilenus, watched as it was lowered onto the metal grid, feeling an immense pride at the sight of the craft. Its usefulness as a cutter was marginal now. Other machines, much larger and more efficient, were already in place, ready to cut the final tunnel from the rock, yet it would serve as their quarters in this final leg of their journey. Earlier, Master Tilenus had given a moving speech as he said farewell to those cadets who would be returning to Donny in the morning. Only Master Geran, Atris, and 5 others remained, their sole task now to represent their guild when finally they broke through to the surface. "How long will it take?" he asked, looking to Tilenus. The guildmaster's attention was on the excavator as strange hands removed the winch chains and began to lift the craft so they could extricate the great cradle from beneath it. His eyes never leaving the delicate task, Tilenus answered Atris quietly.
"A week, maybe less. Why, are you impatient, Atris?"
"No, master."
"Good, because I would hate you to be disappointed."
"I do not understand, master." Tilenus glanced at him.
"The tunnel will be cut, but whether we shall ever step out onto the surface is another matter. There will be one final meeting of the council to decide that."
Atris felt a strange disturbance, a feeling almost of giddiness at the thought of coming so close and never actually stepping out onto the surface of the world. "I thought it had been decided." Tilenus nodded vaguely.
"So did I, yet it is an important matter. Perhaps the most important they have had to debate for many centuries. If they are wrong, then Donny itself might suffer, and so the council deliberate until the last. Why, even today at the feast, they were still discussing it, even as they congratulated one another."
"And if they decide not to?" Tilenus turned and met his eyes.
"Then we go home, Atris."
"And the tunnel?"
"Will be sealed, at least this top part of it. It is unlikely that the surface dwellers have the technology to drill down into the shaft, even if they were to locate it."
"I see."
"No, Atris, neither you nor I see, not as the great lords see. Yet when their final word comes, whatever it may be, we shall do as they instruct."
"And what do you think, Master? Do you think they will let us contact the surface dwellers?" Tilenus laughed quietly.
"If I knew that, Atris, I would be a great lord myself."
That night Atris woke to find the platform trembling as if a giant gong had been struck in the depths. All about him people slept on drunkenly, unaware of the faint tremor. After a while it subsided and the platform was still again. For a moment Atris wondered if he had imagined it, but then it came again, stronger this time, almost audible. Atris shrugged off his blanket and stood, then walked across until he stood close to the edge of the great drop. The whole shaft was vibrating, and now there was the faintest hum, the deep bass note, underlying everything. For close on 3 months the earth had been silent. Now, even as they prepared to leave it, it had awoken once again. Atris turned, looking back to where the guildsmen were encamped beside the excavator, but they slept on in a dead sleep after the feast. He alone was awake. Hurrying across, he bent down beside Master Garin and gently shook him. At first the old man did not wake, but then his blind eyes flicked open.
"Atris?"
Atris did not know how the old man did it, but his senses were infallible. "There's movement," he said quietly. "The shaft was vibrating like a great hollow pipe." Master Garin sat up, then turned to face the center of the tunnel. For a moment he was perfectly still. Then he looked up at Atris again. "Help me up, boy." Atris leaned down, helping him up. "How many times?" Garin asked as he shuffled over to the edge of the shaft. "3 so far. That is, if the one that woke me was the first." Garin nodded, then dropped into a crouch, the fingertips of his right hand brushing gently against the surface of the platform. For 2, maybe 3 minutes they waited, Atris standing there at his side, and then it came again, stronger, much stronger, this time and more prolonged. When it had subsided, Garin stood and shook his head. "It's hard to tell the direction of it. The shaft channels its energy, but it was powerful, Atris. I wonder why I was not woken by it." Atris looked down, a faint smile on his lips, but said nothing. He had seen how much of the strong dawny wine Master Garin had drunk. The only real surprise was that he had woken when Atris had shaken him. "Should we wake the others, Master?" he asked, but Garin shook his head. "No. We shall leave it for now. The final survey will show whether there is any risk. Personally, I doubt it. We have come far to the north of the isopox we identified earlier. If there is any volcanic activity, it is far from here. What we are hearing are merely echoes in the rock, Atris. Impressive, yes, but not harmful." Garin smiled, then patted his arm. "So get some sleep, eh, lad? Tomorrow will be a long day." Reassured by Master Garin, Atris settled back beneath his blanket and was soon asleep once more. If the ground shook, he did not notice it. Indeed, he was the last to wake, Master Tilenus' hand on his shoulder, shaking him, returning him from the dark stupor into which he seemed to have descended.
"Come, Atris. Wash now and get dressed. The ceremony is in half an hour."
They lined up before the cutter, alongside men from the Guild of Maintainers, whose task it would be to oversee this final stage of the journey to the surface. The Maintainers were one of the oldest guilds, and certainly one of the most important. Their Grand Masters, alongside those of the Guild of Writers, the Miners, the Guild of Books, and the Ink Makers, becoming in time the Lords of Dawni, members of the Five. Yet this was a strange and perhaps unique task for them, for normally their job was to ensure that the Dawni books were kept in order, the ages correctly run, and that the long-established laws, laid down countless generations before, were carried out to the letter. They had little to do with excavations and the cutting of tunnels. Indeed, guildsmen from some of the more physical guilds, those who dealt constantly with earth and rock and stone, would, in the privacy of their own guild halls, speak quietly of them in a derogatory fashion as clean-handed fellows. Yet these guildsmen had been specially trained for this purpose, and had among their number guildsmen drafted in from the Guild of Miners and from the Surveyors. They now would carry out the final excavation, and if any surface dwellers were found, it would be the maintainers who would first establish contact, for this was a most delicate matter, and it was held that only the maintainers could be vouchsafed to undertake that task properly. Few of the guildmasters who had been at the feast the day before had remained for this final little ceremony, yet in the small group who now stepped forward were no less than two of the great lords, Lord Tula and Lord Enia. Standing just behind them, among a group of 5 grandmasters, was Veovis. Lord Tula said a few words, then stepped forward, pulling down the lever that would set the great cutter in motion. As he did, Veovis looked across at Atris and gave the tiniest nod. Were these, Atris wondered, the faction in the council who were in favor of making contact with the surface dwellers, or was that a misreading of things? Had the rest perhaps simply been too busy to attend? As Lord Tula stepped back, the engines of the cutter thundered into life, and the circular blade began to spin, slowly at first, then as it nudged the rock with increasing speed. The simple ceremony was concluded. The great men turned away, ready to depart. At a signal from Master Tilanus, the surveyors fell out. Atris could see that Veovis was busy, talking to the Grandmaster of the Guild of Messengers. Content to wait, he watched the machine, remembering the noises in the night. Master Geran had been up early, he had been told, making a new survey of the rock through which this final tunnel was to be dug. His soundings had shown nothing unusual, and the vibrations in the earth had ceased. Both Geran and Tilanus were of the opinion that the quakes had not been serious, but were only the settlement of old faults. Atris himself had not been quite so sure, but had bowed to their experience. Atris, he turned, facing Veovis. The young lord smiled apologetically. You must forgive me, Atris. Once again I must be elsewhere, but I shall return this evening after I have seen Lord Tula off. I did not think he would stay here for the ceremony, but he wished to be here. I understand. Good. And without further word, Veovis turned and hurried across to where Lord Tula was waiting. Atris watched the party step into the special carriage that had been set up on a temporary track down the wall of the shaft, then stepped up to the edge, following its progress down that great well until it was lost to sight. It was strange. The more Veovis delayed their talk, the more uncomfortable Atris found himself at the thought of it. Veovis wanted to be his friend, it seemed, but why? It made little sense to him. Surely Veovis had friends enough on his own. And even if that were not so, why him? Why not someone more suited to his social role? Perhaps it would all come clear. Yet he doubted it. The rock was predictable. It had its moods, yet it could be read, its actions foreseen. But who could say as much of a man? Atris turned, looking back across the platform. Already the cutter was deep in the rock, like a weevil burrowing its way into a log. Crouching, he got out his notebook and, opening it, laid it on his knee, looking about him, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene. This evening, he thought. Then, dismissing it from his mind, he began to sketch. Atris was reaching up, his hands blindly feeling for the scales when the shock wave struck. He was thrown forward, his forehead smacking against the bulkhead as the whole craft seemed to be picked up and rolled over onto its side. For 5 long seconds the excavator shook, a great sound of rending and tearing filling the air, and then silence. Struggling up, Atris put a hand to his brow and felt blood. Outside on the platform a siren was sounding. For a moment the lights in the craft flickered dimly, then the override switch and the emergency lighting came on. In its sudden light he could see that the excavator had been completely overturned. It now lay on its back. Pulling himself hand by hand along the tilted corridor, he climbed out onto the side of the craft and looked about him. Guildsmen were running about, shouting urgently to one another. On the far side of the platform, a huge section of the metal grid had buckled and slipped from its supports and now hung dangerously over the shaft. Behind it, a dark line snaked up the wall of the shaft. Atrus's mouth fell open in surprise. The shaft was breached, the Nara stone torn sheet from sheet. The quake must have been directly beneath them. Looking across, he saw that the mouth of the new tunnel was cracked. A large chunk of rock had fallen from the arch and now partly blocked the tunnel. The cutter, deep inside the tunnel, was trapped. As he stood there, Master Tilenus came over to him and, grasping his arm, turned Atrus to face him.
Atrus, get on protective gear at once, then report back to me. We must secure this area as soon as possible. If there's another quake, the platform could collapse.
Too shocked to speak, Atrus nodded, then ducked back inside, making his way to the equipment room. In a minute he was back, 2 spare canisters of air and a breathing helmet lugged behind him. If the air supply to the shaft had been breached, breathing might soon become a problem, particularly if any of the great ventilation fans had been damaged. Seeing him emerge, Tilenus beckoned him across. Several of the guildsmen were already gathered about him, but of Master Garin there was no sign. Calmly, the simple sound of his voice, enough to steady the frayed nerves of the young men, Master Tilenus organized them, sending some to bring power drills, others to sort out protective clothing. Finally he turned, looking to Atrus.
Master Garin has gone, Atrus, he said quietly. He was standing near the edge when it hit. I saw him go over.
The news came like a physical blow. Atrus gave a tiny cry of pain.
I know, Tilenus said, laying a comforting hand on his shoulder. But we must look after the living now. We do not know the fate of the cutter's crew yet, and there were maintainers with them. If the tunnel came down on them, we may have to try to dig them out.
Atrus nodded, but he was feeling numb now. Garin gone. It did not seem possible. What should I do? He said, trying to keep himself from switching off.
I have a special task for you, Atrus, one that will require an immense amount of courage. I want you to go down and make contact with whoever is in the lower chamber. I want you to let them know how things are up here, that the shaft wall is cracked, the cutting team trapped, and if they can send help, then I want it sent as soon as possible. You have that, Atrus?
Master. But for a moment he simply stood there, frozen to the spot.
Well, Atrus?
Tilenus coaxed gently. The words released him. Strapping one of the cylinders to his back, he pulled on the helmet, then hurried across to the head of the steps. They were blocked. A great sheet of Nara had fallen across the entrance. He would have to find another way down. He went back to where the temporary track began. With the steps blocked, there was only one way down, and that was to climb down the track, hand over hand, until he reached the bottom. For a moment he hesitated, then swinging out over the gap, he grabbed hold of the metal maintenance ladder that ran between the broad rails of the track. Briefly, his eye went to the metal clip at the neck of his uniform. If another big quake struck, he would have to clip himself to the ladder and pray it did not come away from the shaft wall. And if it did... Atrus pushed the thought away and, concentrating on the task at hand, began the descent. Atrus was almost halfway down when the second quake struck. Clipping himself to the metal strut, he locked both arms about the ladder, then dug his toes into the gap between the rung and the wall. This time it went on and on, the whole shaft shaking like a giant organ pipe, things falling from the platform overhead. The metal track beside him groaned, and for a while he thought it was going to prise itself away from the wall as the metal studs strained to come away from the rock, if he wasn't shaken from the ladder first. How long it was he could not tell, but it seemed a small eternity before, with an echoing fall, the shaking stopped. The sudden silence was eerie, and then something clattered on the marble far below. Atrus opened his eyes. Across from him, the shaft wall gaped. Cracks were everywhere now. The great molded sections were untouched, yet there were huge gaps between them now, as if the tunnel wall behind them had slipped backward. The outer wall of the spiral steps had fallen away in many places, and several of the huge securing rivets had jiggled their way out of the rock. The sight made his stomach fall away. It had all seemed so sound, so permanent, yet one more quake, and the whole shaft could easily collapse in upon itself. Unclipping himself, Atreus resumed his descent, ignoring the aches in his calves and shoulders, pushing himself now, knowing that time was against him, but he had not gone far when he stopped dead. There had been a shout just below him. He leaned out, trying to see where it had come from, and at once caught sight of the carriage. Some 40, maybe 50 spans below him, the track bulged away from the shaft wall, pulled outward by the weight of the carriage. As Atreus stared, the shout came again, a cry for help. "Hold on!" he shouted back. "Hold on, I'm coming!" The floor of the shaft was still a good 500 spans below, and looking at the way the track was pulled away from the wall, he knew he would have to climb along the track and over the top of the carriage if he was to help. A length of rope would have come in handy, but he had none. All he had was a canister of air. Making sure his grip on the ladder was good, Atreus reached across and grabbed hold of the rail. Just below where he had hold of it, the bolts that had pinned the track to the shaft wall had been pulled out. The question was, would his extra weight bring a further length of track away from the wall and send the carriage tumbling down to the foot of the great shaft? He would have to take that chance. The outer edge of the track was grooved to match the teeth in the track that ran up one side of the carriage. The great guide wire that ran through the carriage had snapped, so that tooth and groove connection was all that prevented the carriage from falling, if that went. There was the faintest rumble deep in the earth. Things fell with a distant clatter onto the marbled floor below. The metal of the carriage groaned. Now, he told himself, now, before there's another quake. Counting to 5, he swung over onto the track, his fingers wrapped about the tooth-like indentations in the rail. Then he began to edge backward and down, his feet dangling over the abyss. The track creaked and groaned, but did not give. He moved his hands, sliding them slowly along the rail, left hand, then right, his eyes all the while staring at the wall just above him, praying the bolts would hold. And then his toes brushed against the roof of the carriage. He swallowed deeply, then found his voice again. "Are you all right?" There was a moment's silence. Then, in what was almost a whisper, "I'm badly hurt. I've stopped the bleeding, but—" Atreus blinked. That voice. Veovis? There was a groan. Oh. It was Veovis. He was certain of it. "Hold on," Atreus said. "I won't be long now." There was a hatch underneath the carriage. If he could climb beneath it and get into it that way, there was much less chance of him pulling the carriage off its guide track. Yes, but how would he reach the hatch? And what if he could not free the lock? No, this once he had to be direct. He would have to climb over the top of the carriage and lower himself in, praying that the track would bear the extra weight. Slowly Atreus lowered himself onto the roof, prepared at any moment for the whole thing to give. He was breathing quickly now, the blood pounding in his ears. The straps from the cylinder were beginning to cut into his shoulders, and for a moment he wondered if he should slip it off, together with the helmet, and let it fall, but it seemed too much effort. If he was going to die, the cylinder would make no difference. Besides, he was almost there now. He had only to slip his legs down over the edge of the roof and lower himself inside. It was easier said than done. With his legs dangling out over the roof, he realized that he was just as likely to fall out into the shaft as he was to slip inside, into the relative safety of the carriage. Yet even as he thought it, he lost his grip and slipped. With a cry, he reached out and caught hold of the metal bar above the carriage door. His whole body was twisted violently about and then slammed against the side of the carriage. The pain took his breath for a moment. For a full second his feet kicked out over the gap as he struggled to hold on. Then, With a grunt of effort, he swung himself inside. The carriage creaked and groaned as it swung with him. There was the sound of bolts tearing from the wall. One by one they gave with a sharp pinging sound. With a sudden jolt the carriage dropped, throwing Atreus from his feet. Then, with another jolt, it held. Atreus lay on his back, the cylinder wedged under him. He felt bruised all over, but he was alive. Turning his head, he looked across the narrow floor of the carriage. Veovis lay there, not an arm's length from him, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. His flesh, which had seemed pale before, was now ash-white, as if there were no life in him. Moving slowly, carefully, Atreus got himself up into a sitting position, then edged across to where Veovis lay. Veovis looked badly hurt. There was a large bruise at his temple, and blood had seeped through the makeshift bandage he had wrapped about his upper arm. But that would have to wait. His breathing had become erratic. Even as Atreus leaned over him to listen to his chest, Veovis's breath caught and stopped. For a moment, Atreus wasn't sure. Then, knowing that every second counted, he reached behind him and pulled the cylinder up over his head, laying it down at Veovis's side before removing his helmet. Precious seconds were wasted making sure the airflow was working properly. Then, satisfied, he lifted Veovis's head and slipped the helmet on before rolling him over onto his back. The carriage swayed, then settled. Nothing was happening. Atreus blinked, then felt down at the wrist for a pulse. Veovis's heart had stopped. Leaning over him, Atreus pressed into his chest, leaned back, then pressed again. Veovis groaned, then sucked in air. Atreus sat back, knowing that he had done as much as he could. Veovis was in no condition to help himself, and on his own Atreus knew that he would not be able to lift the dead weight of Veovis out of the carriage and back down to the floor of the shaft. There was a faint rumble. Again the carriage shook. Slowly the rumbling grew, stronger and stronger, until Atreus was sure that the carriage would shake itself free from the restraining track. Slowly the light faded, as if a great shadow had formed about them. Then, with a sound of rending metal, the carriage was torn from the track. It tilted sharply forward. Atreus caught his breath, waiting for the fall, but the carriage had stopped in mid-air. Slowly, the walls on either side of him began to buckle inward. "No!" The buckling stopped. With a hiss of hydraulics, the carriage jerked forward, then began slowly to descend with a strange jogging motion. Atreus began to laugh. Relief flooded him. It was a cutter. A cutter had climbed the shaft walls and plucked them from the track. Now, holding them between its cutting arms, it was slowly carrying them down. Atreus leaned across, checking that Veovis was breathing steadily, then sat back, closing his eyes, his head resting against the buckled wall. Safe.